Very fitting for our next guest. Daniel Levy, he's the director of the Middle East program at the European Council on Foreign Relations, a man with a strong inner rabbi, as we've said before, and a friend. Daniel, how are you?
I'm very good, Michael.
So, Daniel, obviously, this what's been happening the past couple of weeks is essential to you personally, professionally. And I think, there's a lot of aspects of this. I think obviously we should touch briefly on the pure humanitarian toll of what's happening in Gaza, what's happening inside Israel. But what I want to really address with you is there's a lot this kind of amorphous debate of why. Why is this happening? There's the defense that Netanyahu and the sort of Israel anytime and at all times people put forward, which is Hamas, 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 and because of Hamas, whatever we do is fine, essentially, and we're responding to the security threat. Then there's just this kind of, I think in some ways, frankly, not directly equivalent, but also kind of vague, well, Israel's just bloodthirsty and just kind of, doing this for the sake of doing it. And I think there is definitely, undoubtedly, collective punishment going on. But I would like you to give us a sense of, is there strategy behind this? What is the thinking of the Netanyahu government? And how does this fit in terms of what they want Gaza and the West Bank to be in their greater Israel project?
So we're running through the night here as I start to address
Yeah.
the 7 next hours. No, let me put it like this. I think the why this is happening, sadly, it comes from a place of well, you don't need to explain it. Obviously, Hamas wake up every morning. Palestinians, Arabs wake up every morning. How can I get the Jews? And how can I get the Israelis? And so it doesn't need explanation. I'm not saying that's what I think. I'm not saying that's what all Israelis think. But I think sometimes it comes from that place. And what people should be aware of is that in Israel, there's the discussion during this conflict has really focused on two things, which is a relentless torrent of self-righteousness and self-justification. Mm-hmm. Why Israel is absolutely right in doing everything it's doing. And secondly, a focus on the minutiae of what's going on militarily. Mm-hmm. So the TV studios are full of ex-generals every night, walking you through blow-by-blow accounts. And there's been precious little discussion of why did this start, what exactly the issues you raised, what is the strategy, what are we trying to do here. The first thing I'd say for people who want a really good background on why this happened is to blow someone else's trumpet and to refer to a piece by Nathan Thrall in the London Review of Books. And if people Google Nathan Thrall London Review of Books, I think it's called Hamas's Chance or Hamas's Chances. So I think that gives people a really good background. But what was Netanyahu trying to achieve here? Mm-hmm. And I think we have to look at 3 phases to what has gone on so far to try and understand that. First phase, there is the killing of 3 Israeli teenagers in the West Bank. It is quite clear that the military and intelligence assessments from day one were that those 3 boys were killed very soon after they came into the hands of those who killed them. Right. I think Netanyahu cynically encouraged this becoming a story of kidnapping. And I think his initial response was to seize on this as an opportunity to do 2 things. First of all, to militarily degrade Hamas and other Palestinian factions in the West Bank, mass arrests, including of Hamas parliament members, a very big military campaign in the West Bank. And secondly, to use this diplomatically to push hard against the Palestinian national reconciliation agreement between
Right.
Hamas and Fatah that had
Right.
been reached. Now, in the wake of that, and combined with a situation in Gaza which is quite desperate, because this equation that quiet will be met with quiet has to be exposed for the nonsense that it is. When there's quiet for Israel, which I hope there will be again, there is anything but normality for the Palestinians. Israel goes back to being totally normal. The Palestinians of Gaza remain under a blockade,
Right.
and no incentive is created for maintaining quiet. So, under these joint circumstances, what's going on in the West Bank, what's going on anyway in Gaza, I think the Hamas responded out of Gaza. Then you came into phase two. Israel decided to launch an operation, not just a response to rocket fire, but a full-scale operation. They gave it a name, which is always an ominous sign, because it means that this is not a one-day thing, protective edge, but it was an air campaign, a drone campaign, an artillery campaign. And I think this was initially designed simply to hit back hard. I think that Netanyahu then felt that having spent the better part of his time as prime minister, constantly sending out warnings, whether it be to the Iranians or the Palestinians, of military measures he was just about to take, and then you'd have useful idiots who would repeat his hype in the Atlantic or in the New York Times.
We know who you're referring to. It's great. Yes, indeed.
So I think he felt, I've got to make good on one of these threats. And Israel went into a deeper engagement.
Passovers could get really awkward at a certain point if none of these scoops turn out to be true ever.
Right, and his threats become rather hollow.
And his threats become hollow, right. Mm-hmm.
So I think Netanyahu then went into a ground operation. I think ever since then he has become a bit stuck. If you were to ask people, what is the goal of this operation, you would get many answers. Netanyahu has been quite consistent. He has said it is to return quiet to Israel. During the operation, tunnels suddenly became almost an existential threat to Israel in the way they would describe. Now, of course, it's a measure that Israel felt it needed to act against in a security way. But tunnels are a tactic. The question is, what do you do? What do you do with a tunnel? What do you do with a rocket? What do you do with a suicide belt? Under what circumstances are you likely to use it or not? And so to wrap up a long answer to your question, it was a long question.
Indeed.
Let me say this. I think Netanyahu's intention here was to degrade Hamas's military capacity and their ability to create a mutual deterrence with Israel, to humiliate Hamas diplomatically, but to have Hamas stay in charge of Gaza, to have the West Bank and Gaza remain split and divided, to undermine Palestinian unity further, and to continue his overall project, which is a project that seeks to create optimal conditions for Israeli ongoing control of the Palestinians, entrenchment of that control, and non-resolution of the conflict. I'm not at all sure he's achieved those goals so far.
No, that makes total sense. And actually, it occurred to me, a couple of weeks ago at the outset of this, that that one of the great paradoxes of Netanyahu until this operation in his present term as prime minister, that you had Ehud Olmert, who much more, a cynical and complicated figure, obviously, but someone who certainly rhetorically and at times in negotiations with Abbas had a much greater understanding of the need to actually have a genuine two-state solution. He initiated Cast Lead. He did the operation in Lebanon. So you had this paradox of the ultra far right prime minister and his far right coalition, as you say, not following through on these things. And then the guy who was talking some really tough talk on settlements and on the nature of Israel, but then still being really willing to unleash these, tremendously intensive campaigns in places like Gaza and Lebanon. And I wondered, how long could Netanyahu sort of hold that political tension of being the sort of the hawk who kind of never struck. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, the other thing that I want to get to, the other 2 points that I think are important is, that's another thing that goes central to the framing is that, well, we need to degrade Hamas. Hamas is an existential threat. And I think just in the same way that anti-Semitism in some ways in many ways gets cheapened by it being thrown around in this debate a lot, the actual threat that Hamas does pose gets really cheapened by saying it's an existential threat. I mean, I think that is, ludicrous on its face. Sending rockets into Israel and killing the occasional civilian is a threat. It should be addressed in some manner. But you're saying Netanyahu doesn't actually want Hamas out of power. So what, and that's what I mean by this kind of management question. So is the vision cripple Gaza and Hamas, but somehow give them enough air to stay in place? And then is the aim at the West Bank to not only undermine Palestinian unity, but really also show, because it seemed a couple of weeks ago with Fatah and Hamas coming together, that this sort of moderate approach of the West Bank leadership was getting vindicated in a lot of ways. And that, from a PR and a positioning perspective, is a very big threat to Netanyahu. If you're not talking about Hamas and terrorism, but you're talking about Abbas and UN resolutions, that doesn't bode well for his policies.
I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is relatively comfortable a militant attempt at liberation, as long as that militancy is not too threatening to Israel. Hence this idea that invariably includes massive, disproportionate civilian casualties on the Palestinian side, this idea of mowing the lawn. And I think he is also comfortable with a Palestinian political leadership that pursues liberation, freedom, basic rights through non-military means, as long as that leadership is sufficiently co-opted and domesticated.
Right.
Right now he has the best of both worlds because neither Hamas's armed resistance nor Abbas's intense moderation are able to galvanize a significant Palestinian broad mobilization, nor to translate international sympathy for what is happening to the Palestinians into a campaign that really begins to create costs for the Israelis when it comes to the impunity and the indulgence that they have gotten used to, and which, it's important to say, I think distorts the public debate in Israel and retards any prospect of Israel making the hard choices and doing the right thing. So, I think this disunity and these two ineffective paths by the Palestinians are something that Netanyahu would be happy to see continuing. Palestinian unity has perhaps been propelled forward by these events in ways that Netanyahu certainly did not intend. And I think the other conclusion one has to draw, unfortunately, from these incidents, is that right now armed resistance would suggest itself as a more effective way of challenging Israeli control than moderation. And that equation is an equation that Israel seems determined to keep teaching to the Palestinians, which is terribly counterproductive.
And could lead to groups that are, frankly, far more violent and far more extreme and far more threatening than Hamas.
Especially especially in the current regional environment. I mean, I think that one of the reasons Netanyahu has essentially called a halt to the ground operation and has said that kind of phase one, mission accomplished, tunnels, now we will continue the operation differently, is he does not want to be in a position where his troops are getting deeper inside Gaza, and that if there is pressure to continue the operation, that pressure he would prefer would translate into an air, drone, sea, artillery bombing of Gaza, rather than a deeper ground incursion, because I think he knows that if he weakens Hamas so much that they can no longer govern, the population of the Gaza Strip is not going to suddenly become philo-Zionist lovers of the invading forces. One other thing I want to say quickly on something you mentioned previously, this contrast between Olmert and Netanyahu. Two things. One, I really think it's important to understand, because there is something of a debate over is Netanyahu, with these more limited ambitions in Gaza, demonstrating that he is actually a pragmatist. I think what you see with Netanyahu is a risk-averse leader, and I think it comes across in all of his policy areas. Sometimes that has its positives, and the fact that we hadn't seen a major military operation by Netanyahu as prime minister until now was part of that, being risk averse. But I don't think it means that he's not ideological. I think he's a deeply ideological Israeli prime minister with a deeply rightist mindset. We see the way he engages in American domestic politics,
Yes.
For instance. So he's an ideologue, but a risk-averse chap. And I think this time around, he simply thought that it was a bigger risk for him politically not to act than to act. And the other sad thing during this conflict is that you have seen strong support from the so-called centrist moderates within the coalition, Livni, who is sometimes a darling of the liberal Zionist camp, and Yair Lapid, the finance minister, as well as the Labour opposition leader. They have all basically taken the Ehud Olmert line, which is we support this military mission, we kill them, and then we make peace with them. Right. And you strengthen Abbas against Hamas. In fact, Abbas vanquishes Hamas. Sadly, that is not as naive today as it was under Ehud Olmert. They have not yet come to terms with the idea that you will need a Palestinian camp that has credibility within its own public's eyes if you want to make progress on peace. And they have also not come to terms with the idea that if you kill so many civilians, unleash such a disproportionate response, then maybe the Palestinians are going to be less ready for peace. Has that crossed your little mind?
Yeah, they're human beings. They have their own prerogatives as well. I mean, as a final question, Daniel, it's just, I think it's important to just get on the table before we wrap up. You've said that, the big part of the context for this is that the Israeli government is tremendously indulged by obviously the United States, Europe as well to a degree. So I guess, do you see a potential shifts in that, or is the pressure, if there is going to be pressure to be brought, is that really going to happen fundamentally through civil society and I guess grassroots activism at that type of level?
Well, I think the theory of political change that has occurred in the past and would seem to apply here is that there is a growing, even during this latest conflict, even despite the much ramped up Israeli propaganda efforts, there is a growing sense of what is right and what is wrong in this conflict, a growing sense that you need to understand the context, you need to understand Palestinian dispossession, that this didn't start yesterday with rockets, that Israel wasn't offering Gaza as some kind of Palestinian Eden that the Palestinians have ruined. There is sympathy and an understanding that this isn't working and indulging Israel isn't working amongst a growing public. The obvious theory of political change is, how does one translate that into something that becomes politically meaningful enough that political leaders have to change their tune somewhat on this and start taking a different approach towards the Israeli leadership, and that the Israeli public in turn say, wait a minute, we seem to have run out of impunity here. We may not like some of this pressure that we're seeing, but what do we do about it? And some will say, down and do what we've always done, and what do you expect from the outside world, etc. And some will say, yeah, that's all very nice, but we've built quite a nice country here. We'd quite like it to stay that way. This South Africa scenario isn't a fun one. We better make some hard choices. Ugh, we don't want to make those choices. We better make them. How you get from sympathy and from a better understanding to politically meaningful campaigns, I think will probably require a change in strategy by the Palestinian leadership. This seems to be the most obvious missing link here. And then I think if you did have a different Palestinian leadership strategy, one that could build a broader church, so to speak, have a more effective impact, first of all in the region.
Yeah.
First of all, translate sympathy in surrounding countries in the Muslim world, then elsewhere. And do it by, and I think it's important to say, also do it in a way that draws a very clear line when it comes to anti-Semitism,
Yes.
when it comes to hate speech, when it comes to vilifying people en masse. I think there is it's far too easily used, the accusation of anti-Semitism. I think it's cynically used. I think Jewish leadership in many institutions deploy this cynically. I think the Israeli government deploys it with extreme cynicism. But I also want to be clear. I think that Palestinian solidarity has to cleanse itself of that animus which exists in parts in its midst, and that is going to allow a more effective campaign, and it's going to make life much less simple for liberal Jews, by the way,
Yes.
both inside Israel and outside, who right now can say, "Oh, I don't want to go too close to that," but who are going to have to ask themselves much harder questions if and when such a development happens. It saddens me, but I think we'd probably acknowledge that it will be more effective in many places before it becomes really politically effective in the United States.
I think that's definitely true, but it's very interesting. I mean, the Palestinians should really be studying the African National Congress playbook in all of these ways, from cultural diplomacy, anti-racism, opposed to anti-Semitism, and sort of building those broader coalitions. That makes a lot of sense. Daniel Levy, the director of the Middle East Studies Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations, I really appreciate your time, as always, and more Bob Marley soon.
Thank you. You take care.